I was brushing the last layer of butter across the crust when the oven clicked warm behind me. The kitchen smelled faintly of nutmeg and cinnamon, the way it always did when Grandma baked. Tomorrow's fair was only hours away, and for the first time, her recipe would stand under my name. The counters were lined with cooling pies, their golden edges promising more than just dessert. They felt like proof that her memory still mattered. This is just the start of how a family recipe turned into something larger than all of us. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I should have felt ready. Instead, I caught myself staring at the old index card, the faded ink nearly gone from years of touch. The weight of it pressed heavier than any trophy, and when I reached for the first pie, I saw the crack in its center, splitting wide under the kitchen light, as if warning me that tomorrow wouldn't unfold the way I'd imagined. So let's get into what happened after that crack appeared across the pie. I remember staring at it far longer than I should have, as if it had something to tell me. The crust was supposed to be perfect. That was the point of Grandma's recipe. No shortcuts, no store-bought tricks, no surrender to convenience. She always said you could tell who someone was by the way their crust held together. That night, mine split right down the middle. I wrapped it in foil anyway. The fair wasn't going to wait for me to fix my mistakes. By midnight, the kitchen was crowded with pies cooling on every surface. Some were beautiful, with glossy tops and edges that curled like folded lace. Others were a little uneven, their shapes awkward, but they smelled just the same. I tried to imagine the judges leaning closer, the way Grandma used to when she tested each batch, cutting a sliver and raising her eyebrows before speaking. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, I found myself leafing through the old recipe box, the one she kept on top of the refrigerator. Most families I knew had their traditions tucked into glossy cookbooks. Ours lived in scraps of paper, stained napkins, and the back of envelopes. The pie crust recipe was written in her tight cursive, fading at the corners. My thumb had traced the same loop of her G in Grandma's so many times it was soft to the touch. When morning came, the sky was washed in gray. I loaded the pies into the back seat, securing them with folded towels like they were fragile antiques. Driving to the fairgrounds, I passed the chain grocery store that had opened only 5 years ago. Their parking lot was already full, people rushing in for brand-name pies stacked in shiny boxes. That sight twisted something in me, and not quite jealousy, not quite anger. Just the reminder of how quickly people forgot the things made with patience. At the fair, the booths stretched down the main street, bright with banners and the smell of fried batter. My hands shook when I set up my table. I kept my head down as I laid out the pies, feeling small between vendors with polished displays. One woman nearby had a stack of pastries wrapped in plastic, each with a bold logo stamped across the top. She caught me glancing and smiled like she already knew I didn't belong. By mid-morning, the crowd thickened. Strangers drifted past, pausing only if the scent caught them. A few leaned in to ask what made my pies different. My throat tightened each time, but I told them the truth. It was my grandmother's recipe. No preservatives, no shortcuts, just the way she taught me. Some nodded politely and moved on. Others stayed, tasting small slices I'd cut and left on paper plates. Watching their eyes widen with surprise felt like oxygen filling my lungs. Then came the first sale. A middle-aged man with paint on his shirt handed me a few crumpled bills and carried a pie away under his arm like treasure. It startled me that someone would choose my pie over the neat uniform ones down the road. After him came another and then a family of 3. The stack on my table began to shrink. Each time I thought of Grandma standing beside me, her hands on her hips whispering, "See? They taste the difference." Still, I couldn't ignore the pressure building in my chest. The woman with the branded pastries had a line forming in front of her booth. Shiny packaging won over most people, even here. I watched her customers walk past me, bags swinging from their wrists, and for a moment, doubt returned like a cold wind. What was I doing? How could one fading recipe matter in a world built on efficiency and advertising? By the time the judges arrived, my voice was raw from explaining the same story again and again. They circled the tables slowly, notebooks in hand. When they stopped at mine, I tried not to fidget. One judge cut into the pie with a plastic knife. The crust flaked the way it should, crumbling lightly but holding its shape. He tasted a bite and exchanged a look with the others. My stomach flipped as I waited, but they only scribbled something down and moved on. The rest of the day blurred. By late afternoon, only 2 pies remained on my table. The branded booth was nearly empty, too, her boxes stacked in neat rows behind her. I couldn't tell who sold more, and maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was the line of customers who lingered after tasting mine, asking where they could get more outside the fair. Each time I stumbled for an answer. I hadn't thought past today. When the sun dipped low and the ribbons were handed out, I stood near the back clutching a paper cup of lemonade. I didn't win first place. That honor went to a polished booth with candied tarts shaped like flowers. But when they called my name for third, the applause felt louder than I expected. Strangers smiled at me as I walked forward, the ribbon in my hand, light but meaningful. Driving home that night, the last 2 pies sat in the passenger seat. The smell of cinnamon filled the car. I rolled the window down, letting the cool air mix with it. Something inside me shifted. Small, quiet, but certain. I hadn't beaten the brand, not yet. But I'd seen enough in the faces of the people who chose my pies to know this wasn't over. The crack in the crust hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. Driving home that night, I thought the fair was the end of it. I had sold most of the pies, won a small ribbon, and carried back the last 2 as if they were reminders that this was just a family moment. Nothing more. But the next morning, I woke to a message on my phone. It was from a woman I barely remembered. She had bought one of the pies late in the afternoon. She asked where she could get more. Her kids had eaten the entire thing in one sitting. I almost laughed. More? There was no more. I had only baked for the fair, and every batch had taken hours of rolling, chilling, and baking. Still, her message tugged at me. I wrote back politely, explaining it was just a family recipe, not something I sold. Within an hour, another message arrived from someone else. Then another. By noon, 5 different people were asking the same question. When could they buy again? The messages unsettled me. I wasn't a business owner. I wasn't prepared for orders. But the thought of those strangers actually seeking out Grandma's recipe lit a spark I couldn't shake. I pulled one of the leftover pies from the fridge, sliced a piece, and tasted it myself. The crust held, the filling was steady, and the flavor was everything I remembered from my childhood kitchen. Maybe it wasn't just nostalgia. Maybe it really was something different. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the recipe card again. Grandma used to tell me food was memory. Every bite carried something forward. Looking at the stains on that card, I realized she hadn't written it down just for herself. She'd written it so someone after her could keep it alive. Maybe that someone was me? The next weekend, I baked 6 pies. Not for a fair, not for family dinner, but for the handful of people who had asked. I wrapped them in foil, packed them carefully into brown boxes, and drove around town delivering them one by one. At each stop, I saw surprise on their faces, as if they hadn't truly expected me to follow through. They pressed money into my hands, too much for what I thought they were worth. When I tried to refuse, they insisted. That night, for the first time, I counted cash earned not from a job, but from my grandmother's recipe. Word spread faster than I expected. A week later, my phone buzzed with twice as many requests. Soon, I couldn't keep up with the oven alone. I borrowed a second mixer from a cousin, rearranged the kitchen counters, and cleared the pantry to make space for flour bags and sugar tubs. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. My evenings became a blur of rolling dough, brushing crusts, and boxing pies. The strain grew heavier, though. Sleep shortened, and my arms ached from kneading. Still, each time someone smiled as they picked up a pie, the exhaustion felt like something I could carry. I started to realize the recipe was pulling me forward, giving me direction where before there had been only routine. It wasn't about money yet. It was about the sense that something ordinary we'd almost lost was suddenly alive again. A month after the fair, a small cafe owner called. She had tasted one of my pies at a neighbor's gathering and wanted to know if I could supply her weekly. My first reaction was to say no. Supplying a cafe meant consistency, and I wasn't sure I could deliver on that scale. But she pressed, promising to start small. She would buy 3 pies a week. I heard Grandma's voice in my head. Say yes to the chance, then figure it out later. So I said yes. That first delivery, I carried the pies into the cafe on Main Street with my heart pounding. The owner placed them in her display case beside cakes from a well-known distributor. Customers glanced, curious, and by the end of the day, all 3 were gone. The owner called me that night, asking for more the next week. It was only then I realized I had stumbled into something bigger than myself. Grandma's recipe wasn't just filling bellies. It was carving out a place in a market dominated by glossy packaging and corporate advertising. People weren't just buying food, they were buying memory, comfort, and the feeling of something real. Of course, it wasn't all simple. Scaling up meant cost, and soon I was spending more on ingredients than I had planned. My tiny kitchen felt cramped, and neighbors started to complain about the smell of baking that lingered into late hours. Still, I kept going. Every week the cafe sold out, and every week new customers asked for direct orders. Late one night, I sat at the counter surrounded by receipts and ingredient lists, and it hit me. This was turning into a business whether I wanted it or not. The thought was terrifying. What if I failed? What if people grew tired of it? What if the brand pies pushed back with discounts and promotions? I leaned against the counter, staring at the ribbon from the fair that still hung on the refrigerator door. It wasn't first place, but it was proof. Proof that Grandma's recipe had already done something more than I'd ever expected. By the end of that season, the cafe had doubled its order. I had a list of private customers waiting each week. And still, whenever I pulled out the stained index card, I whispered a thank you to the woman who had written it. She had never seen it outsell anything, but she had believed that tradition mattered, that effort mattered, and that people could taste the difference. I realized then that this wasn't just about pies. It was about carrying something forward when the world wanted to push it aside. By the end of that season, I thought I had found a rhythm. The cafe's weekly orders doubled, neighbors began greeting me with questions about the pie lady, and my evenings were filled with rolling dough across the same worn counter Grandma once used. But momentum never moves in a straight line. It pulls attention, and attention has a way of drawing resistance. The first sign came quietly. A customer mentioned that the chain grocery store had started running a heritage series of pies, advertising them as home-style crusts inspired by tradition. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, those glossy brands had drowned out local bakers, pushing convenience and packaging over flavor. Now, suddenly, they were selling the very idea they had dismissed. I shrugged it off at first. What did it matter if they were running a new ad? My pies were still selling out, and my customers weren't walking away. But then I noticed the flyers slipped into mailboxes around town, bright with photos of golden crusts and bold discounts. Buy 2, get 1 free. It wasn't about taste. It was about power, the ability to undercut anyone who tried to compete. The cafe owner called me one evening, her voice steady but strained. She explained that sales had dipped for the first time since we started. People were curious about the discounted pies, and she couldn't blame them. Times were tight. If the grocery store was selling 2 for the price of 1, many families didn't have the luxury of choosing mine. That night, I sat at the counter staring at the index card again. Grandma's handwriting looked steady, unfazed, as if the recipe itself didn't care about competition, but I cared. I had put weeks into building something fragile, and the thought of losing it so soon twisted my stomach. Still, I couldn't just give up. The next morning, I drove to the farmer's market with a fresh batch. My table looked the same as always. Pies cooling under foil, samples laid out in small slices. A few customers hesitated before buying, glancing down the road toward the store's booth, where brand representatives were handing out coupons. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to smile and offer another slice. The day moved slower than usual, but something happened I didn't expect. A woman stopped at my booth, bought a pie, and then pulled me aside. She whispered that she used to work at the chain's bakery division. She told me their heritage pies weren't made with any secret recipe. They were frozen crust with flavor enhancers, pushed out in bulk. They'll never taste like yours, she said. Don't let them scare you. Her words settled into me like a steady anchor. It wasn't about competing on price. It was about proving there was still a place for food made by hand, with patience, not machinery. So I leaned harder into what made mine different. I wrote a small note to tuck into each box, explaining the story behind the recipe. Not marketing language, just truth. I wrote about Grandma teaching me to roll the dough on summer nights, about her belief that food carried memory, about how one recipe had survived through decades because it meant something. Customers noticed. They started telling others, not just about the pies, but about the story. Orders picked up again, this time stronger than before. It wasn't just food they were buying, it was the connection, the reminder that real things still existed in a world of shortcuts. The brand didn't stop pushing. Their ads grew bolder, their discounts sharper. One weekend, they even set up a free tasting booth directly across from my farmer's market stall. The air felt heavy that morning, as if the space between us was a silent challenge, but when customers tasted both, many came back to me, shaking their heads. There's no comparison, one man said, dropping cash into my hand without waiting for change. I realized then that the competition wasn't going away. If I wanted this to last, I couldn't just rely on word of mouth. I needed to think bigger, to find ways to reach beyond my kitchen and beyond one cafe. The thought scared me. Bigger meant risk, and risk meant stepping into a world where the brand had always won. But I thought of Grandma again. She never believed in hiding from challenges. She believed in standing firm with what you had, even if it was only a recipe scribbled on a fading card. That night, I pulled out a notebook and started making lists. Ingredient costs, order numbers, potential places that might carry my pies. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine this not just as a side effort, but as a real path forward. The crack in that first pie crust had taught me things fall apart. But the days that followed were teaching me something else. If you refuse to walk away, even the smallest recipe can hold its ground against giants. That night, with the notebook open in front of me, I realized the choice was simple. Either let this remain a side story that faded when pressure mounted, or step into something larger than I had ever planned. I didn't sleep much. I kept running numbers, scratching them out, and writing them again. Flour, sugar, butter, packaging, delivery. It all added up quickly, and my kitchen wasn't built for the scale I was beginning to imagine. The next morning, I called the cafe owner. I told her I wanted to try a larger order just to see if I could handle it. She agreed immediately, almost too quickly, as though she had been waiting for me to take that step. The following week, instead of 3 pies, I delivered 10. She cleared space in her display case, and by the end of the day, they were gone. Soon after, another call came, this time from a small grocery cooperative on the edge of town. One of their managers had stopped by the cafe, tasted a slice, and wanted to stock my pies for the holidays. The idea made my pulse quicken. It wasn't just a farmer's market table anymore. It was shelves, inventory, and schedules. I hesitated but said yes. Those first deliveries nearly broke me. I had to borrow coolers from family members, rent oven time from a church kitchen, and rope in 2 cousins to help with rolling and boxing. My house became a staging ground, every corner piled with ingredients and packaging. Sleep came in short bursts, but orders were met, and when I walked into that co-op and saw my pies on the shelf beside national brands, something in me shifted. For the first time, Grandma's recipe wasn't just surviving. It was standing shoulder to shoulder with the competition. It didn't take long for word to spread beyond our town. A local food blogger wrote about the small batch pies with a story behind them, and suddenly emails were coming in from nearby cities. People wanted to know if I shipped. I had no system for shipping, no idea how to keep a crust from crumbling across state lines, but I felt the pull of possibility. Still, every step forward came with new weight. The more orders I took, the more the costs rose. Butter prices spiked 1 month, and I nearly panicked thinking I wouldn't cover expenses. Equipment broke, schedule slipped, and I found myself wondering if I had stretched too far. More than once, I caught myself staring at the grocery store ads, wondering if the brand was watching me the way I was watching them. But every doubt met an answer. Customers wrote messages about how the pies reminded them of their childhood kitchens. A woman stopped me in the co op to say her mother, who hadn't eaten much in weeks, had devoured a slice and asked for more. These weren't just sales, they were reminders that what I was doing mattered, even if it hurt to keep up with the pace. By spring, I faced a decision I couldn't avoid: keep baking from borrowed kitchens and sleepless nights, or find a real space. Renting a bakery meant risk, contracts, and overhead. It also meant legitimacy. I spent weeks visiting empty storefronts, running my hand along cold counters, trying to picture Grandma rolling dough there. Most spaces were too large or too costly. But finally, I found one: a narrow shop near the main street. Small but workable. The lease scared me, but when I signed, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt like I had finally claimed this path instead of just stumbling into it. Opening day was chaos. Family showed up to help, customers lined up with curiosity, and I nearly ran out of pies by noon. The sign above the door was simple: just the family name and the word pies. Nothing flashy, nothing corporate. But when I stood in that kitchen with flour dusting my apron and the hum of ovens filling the air, I thought of Grandma again. She had never wanted recognition, but she had wanted her recipes to last. That day, it felt like they would. Of course, the competition didn't fade. The national brand noticed. Their promotions grew louder, their prices dropped lower, and they flooded the town with ads about authentic taste. It was clear they were trying to drown me out. But something had shifted in the community. People weren't just buying food anymore. They were choosing a story, a memory, a connection. And as long as they tasted the difference, I knew I had a chance to keep building. Looking back, I think that was the moment I stopped asking if I could survive and started asking how far this could go. Not just for me, but for the name on that recipe card. And for every person who ever thought their small tradition didn't stand a chance against something bigger. Looking back, I think that was the moment I stopped asking if I could survive and started asking how far this could go. Not long after the bakery opened, that question was tested in ways I couldn't have predicted. A man walked in one afternoon, dressed in a button-down shirt and carrying a briefcase. He wasn't there to buy a pie for dinner. He introduced himself as a representative from a regional distributor. He had heard about the bakery through the cafe owner and wanted to talk about putting my pies in several stores across 3 counties. I wiped my hands on my apron, suddenly aware of the flour smudges across my sleeves, and invited him to sit. He explained how it would work: packaging standards, delivery schedules, supply guarantees. His voice was calm, practiced, and professional. My mind, however, spun faster than I could keep up. Regional shelves meant exposure I'd never dreamed of. It also meant pressure I wasn't sure I could handle. I told him I'd need time to think. He nodded, left his card, and walked out as quietly as he had arrived. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my family, the business card between us. The words regional distribution hung heavy in the room. Some encouraged me to take the leap, pointing out that opportunities like this didn't come twice. Others warned me about losing control, about the dangers of chasing growth that could swallow me whole. I listened, but I also thought of Grandma. She hadn't written her recipe to be locked away. She believed in sharing, in feeding people. Maybe this was the next step in honoring that. The following week, I called the distributor and agreed to a trial run. We started small, 10 stores, limited stock. I spent days figuring out packaging that would protect the crust but still look simple and honest. No shiny logos, no flashy colors, just a box with a clear window and the family name stamped across the top. When the first order left the bakery in a borrowed van, my stomach twisted. But there was also a thrill I couldn't deny. Sales came in quicker than I expected. Within a month, the pies were selling out in most of the trial stores. Customers wrote emails asking where they could find them, and one store manager called to say people were waiting at the door on delivery days. The distributor came back, smiling this time, asking if I was ready to expand further. Growth didn't come without strain. The ovens ran nonstop, employees worked longer shifts, and I found myself buried under spreadsheets, schedules, and phone calls. Some nights I barely touched the rolling pin, my time swallowed by logistics instead of dough. The bakery had become something larger than I could manage alone. I hired more help, trained them carefully, and hoped they would treat the recipe with the same respect. Letting go of control wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The national brand didn't ignore the shift. Billboards appeared along highways boasting about their heritage pies. Their discounts cut deeper. Their packaging mimicked the rustic look of mine. It was clear they saw me not as a curiosity anymore, but as competition. Fear pressed against me, but so did determination. I couldn't match their advertising, but I didn't need to. What I had was a story, and no corporation could duplicate that. One evening, I walked into a store to check the shelves. My pies sat in a neat row beside the national brand. A woman stood there, holding one of each. She turned the boxes over, reading the labels, then looked up at me without realizing who I was. She put the brand back on the shelf and carried mine to the register. That moment stayed with me. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about trust. As the year turned, the distributor pushed for an even bigger expansion, 50 stores this time, covering nearly the entire region. My heart pounded as I signed the papers. The risk was enormous. Supply had to be consistent, quality couldn't slip, and any mistake could cost me everything I had built. But as I loaded the next batch of pies into trucks bound for towns I had never visited, I thought again of the crack in that first crust. What had felt like failure then was now proof that nothing had to be perfect to matter. With each new delivery, the recipe reached kitchens that had never heard of our family before. Letters began arriving at the bakery, handwritten notes from strangers who said the pies tasted like their grandmothers or reminded them of Sunday dinners long gone. I read each one slowly, saving them in a box the same way Grandma had saved her recipes. By spring, the bakery was no longer just a small shop on Main Street. It was a hub, a place where tradition met scale. And yet, even as pallets rolled out the door, I still found time late at night to roll a crust by hand, pressing the dough the way Grandma had shown me. It grounded me, reminded me why I had started. The national brand wasn't finished, though. Rumors swirled that they were planning a lawsuit, claiming my packaging looked too similar to theirs. The thought of facing lawyers in courtrooms made my hands shake. But deep down, I knew they weren't after the packaging. They were after the idea that something small could grow into a threat. That realization didn't weaken me. It steeled me for what was coming next. The realization that the brand might take me to court didn't leave my mind for days. I tried to focus on the rolling pins, the dough, the daily shipments stacked at the door. But behind every task was the thought of lawyers, claims, and papers I didn't understand. It was one thing to fight for shelf space. It was another to be dragged into a legal battle I couldn't afford. A letter arrived within a week, printed on heavy paper with a law firm's name across the top. They accused me of infringing on their design, saying my packaging was deceptively similar to theirs. Reading the words made my stomach twist. I had worked so hard to keep everything simple and honest. A clear window, a plain label, nothing more. I never copied anyone. But none of that mattered. They had money, and money meant power. I sat at the counter with the letter in my hands, wondering if this was where the dream ended. My family gathered around me, reading over my shoulder, anger flashing across their faces. My cousin slammed his hand against the table, insisting I fight. My aunt reminded us that Grandma never backed down, even when things looked impossible. But fighting meant lawyers of my own, bills piling up, and time taken away from baking. For a moment, I thought about walking away, closing the bakery before the storm could hit. News spread faster than I expected. Customers heard about the letter and began asking questions. Some were worried I'd shut down. Others promised to stand by me no matter what. One morning, a reporter showed up at the bakery door. She had heard rumors about a small-town shop being threatened by a national company. I hesitated to talk, but something in me snapped. If they wanted to silence me, I wouldn't make it easy. I told her the truth. This was my grandmother's recipe, my family's name, and no corporation could claim ownership of either. The story ran in the local paper. A photo of me holding a pie appeared on the front page, and suddenly the bakery was busier than ever. People drove from nearby towns, lining up outside the door, not just for the pies, but to show support. Social media picked it up next with strangers posting pictures of my boxes, saying they tasted better than anything in the freezer aisle. What had started as a threat turned into a wave of attention I never saw coming. The brand responded with another round of discounts, trying to pull customers back, but it didn't work the same this time. Too many people had read the article. Too many wanted to side with the underdog. Every day, I met someone new who said they came because they'd heard my story. It wasn't just pie anymore. It was a statement. The lawsuit didn't vanish overnight. Their lawyers sent more letters, pressing harder, but I wasn't alone anymore. A volunteer lawyer from town offered to represent me, refusing to charge a fee. He said he believed in what I was doing, that it reminded him of his own mother's cooking. Together, we drafted responses, pushed back, and refused to be intimidated. Weeks turned into months. The legal noise didn't stop, but neither did the orders. In fact, demand grew. Stores that had once hesitated to carry my pies now called asking for stock, saying customers requested them by name. It was surreal, watching my grandmother's recipe become a rallying point against a company that thought it could bury me. One afternoon, I stood in the bakery watching a group of teenagers share a pie at the corner table. They laughed, argued over who got the last slice, and left crumbs scattered across the plates. For a moment, I forgot about the lawyers and the paperwork. I just saw what Grandma always wanted: food bringing people together. That was worth more than any ribbon, any sales sheet, or any fear of losing. The brand eventually backed off. They didn't admit defeat, but the letters stopped, and their ads grew quieter. Maybe they realized the fight had only given me more attention. Maybe they didn't want the bad press. Whatever the reason, the silence from them felt like victory. Not loud, not final, but enough. I thought back to that first crack in the crust, the one that made me think nothing would go as planned. I hadn't been wrong. Nothing had gone the way I expected, but each break, each challenge had only pushed me into places I never thought I'd reach. Standing there in the bakery, the ovens humming behind me and the smell of cinnamon filling the air, I knew we had already gone further than I'd ever dreamed. And yet, deep down, I also knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of what the recipe was meant to become. And yet, deep down, I also knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of what the recipe was meant to become. The quiet from the brand gave me room to breathe, but it also left me staring at a larger question. What now? We had survived the legal threat, the ads, the discounts, and yet demand was higher than ever. The distributor called again, this time offering placement in big box stores. They weren't asking for a trial run anymore. They wanted statewide supply, which meant hundreds of shelves, thousands of pies, and a scale I could barely imagine. I drove out to one of those stores just to see what it felt like. The aisles stretched on forever, lit bright and cold, with products stacked high in identical rows. For a moment, I wondered if Grandma's recipe belonged there at all. It wasn't designed for mass production. It was meant to be rolled by hand, pressed with care, baked the way she taught me. I stood there, torn between fear of losing its soul and the chance to honor her by letting it reach farther than she ever dreamed. After days of pacing and long nights at the kitchen table, I agreed. Not because I wanted to chase scale, but because I realized the recipe had already become more than mine to hold back. People wanted it, people trusted it, and I couldn't keep it locked in a single shop forever. If Grandma had believed food was memory, then maybe this was the way to make sure her memory lived in as many kitchens as possible. The shift was overwhelming. Production doubled, then tripled. I invested in larger equipment, hired more bakers, and trained each one with the same words Grandma used with me. You can't rush a crust. If it doesn't rest, it breaks. I watched new hands press dough, and though it felt strange to see others do what had always been mine, it was also humbling. The recipe was moving beyond me, becoming something collective. When the pies finally landed in statewide stores, I didn't go to see them right away. I couldn't bring myself to face that aisle again. Instead, I focused on the bakery, the staff, the endless stream of orders. But one afternoon, a friend sent me a photo. It showed my pies stacked higher than I'd ever seen, sitting beside the national brand, not tucked into a corner, but filling an entire display. The caption read, "You did it." Sales reports followed. Numbers I could barely comprehend. Store after store, showing my pies outselling the brands for the first time. In some locations, we weren't just competing, we were leading. I sat at the desk in the back of the bakery with the report in my lap, tears I hadn't expected sliding down my face. For years, they had been the standard. Now, Grandma's recipe had passed them. It wasn't just about numbers, though. Something deeper was happening. Customers began sending stories of their own, how they served the pies at weddings, at funerals, at family reunions. A teacher wrote that her students sold slices at a fundraiser and raised more money than they'd ever managed before. Each story felt like another thread woven into the fabric of what we had built. One evening after closing, I stood alone in the bakery and pulled out the original index card. The ink was faded, the paper soft from years of touch, but the words were still there. I placed it in a frame and hung it on the wall above the ovens. The staff gathered the next morning and stared at it quietly, almost reverently. It wasn't just a recipe anymore. It was a reminder of why we were here. The brand never admitted defeat. They still lined shelves, still ran ads, still pushed coupons. But everyone knew what had shifted. For once, the small-town recipe wasn't the underdog anymore. It was proof that tradition could stand its ground and even outlast the giants who thought they owned the market. When I think back to that first crack in the crust, I smile now. At the time, it felt like failure. But maybe it was always meant to split, to remind me that perfection wasn't the point. The point was to keep going, to trust that what held inside mattered more than how it looked on the surface. I don't know what the future will bring. Maybe we'll expand further. Maybe we'll stay right where we are. But I do know this. Grandma's recipe outsold a national brand, and in doing so, it carried her memory farther than I could have ever imagined. And for the first time, I don't feel like I'm chasing anything. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. If the story of Grandma's recipe rising against all odds moved you, you'll want to hear what came next. Follow the link for the powerful tale of a family torn apart by betrayal. My trader's son wanted $200,000 for his business. I gave $50,000 to my granddaughter instead. Don't miss it.